and for this event to get going, and to see your lovely faces and to be able to come together as a community to celebrate these amazing queer women who have done such brave and wonderful work of running for office and for organizing really important political movements in the state of Connecticut. So a few tips for Zoom. You will be muted upon entry until I unmute you using the chat function later on in the event. So we will allow for some audience participation as we go forward, but for now it's just going to be a conversation between me and our two lovely panelists. So yeah, if you want the streaming to go as smoothly as possible, I recommend that you keep your camera off. This does not go for Nadja and Evelyn, but this does go for people in the audience, just because it takes more bandwidth to stream it.
If you go in control on your keyboard.
Yeah, and with that being said, I'm super excited to begin. My name's Miranda. I use they, them pronouns. I'm the LGBTQ Women's Program Officer at the New Haven Pride Center. And I consider myself a young political organizer and a really passionate person. With that, I would love for Evelyn and for Nadja to introduce themselves. With name,
hi,
pronouns,
everyone.
a little bit about what you do.
Would you like me to go ahead?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Evelyn Mantilla, and I am very pleased to be part of this panel. There is nothing that excites me more than to encourage women, young people, people of color to get involved in the political system and especially to run for office. So Miranda, thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to this conversation.
Right,
Hi, I'm Nigel Phelps. I'm a fellow organizer at the Women's March Connecticut with Evelyn and a bunch of other wonderful women. I ran for office locally in Milford a couple of years ago, and since then I've been working on their DTC to get other Dems elected. And a few years before that, some friends and I co-founded an indivisible group, Fairfield Standing United, where we work lots of different organizations for various causes to create more equality and equity.
That's amazing. So how are we all feeling today? I know that this pandemic has got us feeling a little bit tense and everything, as well as, you know, the ongoing political crises that we're in as a result of, you know, this ongoing public health issue. How are you two feeling?
I'm doing rather well. I have the strong support of my family, my wife and my two children. My two daughters are all kind of behaving, following the guidelines, staying close, spending time together. So that has helped tremendously. I do keep up with all of the changes and all of the reports. I admit I'm watching the news a little too much. But it's a little bit of the nature of my to do, particularly because I really want to see how leadership works or doesn't work in support of all of our the residents of our country, really. So I'm doing all right.
Yeah. How about you, Nigel?
I'm doing pretty good most days. Same as Evelyn, I like to watch the news, probably too much, but I just really want to stay informed, you know, seeing what my city says versus what our state says versus what the federal says. And I'm an extrovert, so it's especially hard to keep social distancing, but it's important. So I've been doing Zoom and lots more, you know, Facebook watch parties and talking on the phone with people. My husband's working from home some of the days of the week, but not all the days of the week. So I have him and that's great, but it's also, you know, concerning that he still has to go out there, that he's considered an essential worker when I'd rather that he could just be at home.
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear that. Fingers crossed, and please do stay safe. On the topic of the news, actually, I was wondering if we could just start this off, you know, on some more positive vibes. Are there any news stories that have inspired you lately, or people in your life that are really keeping you going during this crisis?
I have one actually. A wonderful friend of my family's happens to own a medical equipment company, and she it's just been inspiring to watch her um, do the best she can, not just as a businesswoman, but really foregoing profit to be able to get equipment in the hands of the people that need it the most.
Yeah.
And then just, her name is Sandy. And most recently, it was really cool to watch. She offered a box of gloves to the staff people from the Science Center who are still working hard to take care of the animals. The West
Oh,
Hartford,
wow.
yeah, Science Center, who are working very hard to take care of the animals that are there, and they're not receiving any much support except from the public. So that's my good feel good story.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What about you, Nija?
I have two. One is I'm pregnant right now, and not being able to have a baby shower traditionally has been difficult and challenging. And so there's various virtual options that you can do. And, I wasn't sure exactly if I wanted to do that, if it would be boring for people. And then I saw that there was a little girl who turned 5, and her mom got a bunch of her friends parents to drive by and do a parade sort of thing. They had made signs, and so she got to stand outside her house and wave at everybody. And for a little kid who doesn't really understand what's going on and why things are being taken away from them, I thought that was a perfect solution. And so that really made my heart happy. And then the other thing is similar to what Evelyn said, is all the people who come together, especially business owners, but also everyday people who are trying their best to make more masks or donate masks they might have and any other PPEs that our healthcare workers need. It's really good to know that the community will come together, even if we're not getting the kind of funding and support that we'd like from the various levels of government, that the community will come together and take care of each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking to that, for my own personal inspiring story, I'm also a senior at Yale currently, and while we're all feeling very sort of robbed of those final moments and those final months together with our peers, as well as the ability to walk the stage, it's been really fantastic to see many of my fellow students from all across the political spectrum even come together to organize a profession on the university to give back to the New Haven community as it should be. And I've just been really inspired by the work that they've been doing, as well as going home to their communities and immediately beginning to figure out what they can do to help out, whether it's volunteering to deliver groceries, to join mutual aid groups, and so forth. So it's been really exciting to see that despite the fact that young people are currently, we're facing unemployment and a lot of insecurity about the future at this time that we thought we were going to be able to celebrate. There's still a lot of organizing and action being done to give back to the community. So that's been really exciting for me. So I wanted to talk a little bit about our stories and what those mean to us. So for the first question I have, when did you first realize you might be queer, that you might identify as bisexual, and when did you first choose to embrace that identity?
Nigel, why don't I have you tackle that one first?
For me, it was, I guess, sometime in my mid to late 20s, which was strange because I had very much been an ally before then. And I don't know, I guess I focused a lot outwardly on other people. I like to help people a lot. So sometimes if I get busy doing things, I don't always pay attention to what's going on internally. And I don't know what it was. One day I was just like, oh, that woman's really attractive. Oh, that means something, doesn't it? Even though I was surrounded by people who lived that all the time and had, supportive friends, that wasn't the issue. I just hadn't really looked at myself that way. And as far as embracing it, I think that took a while just because, you have an identity and you hold on to that because you feel like if you change any part of it, then what you were saying before was false, or you don't really know who you are. But we change and grow, hopefully, over our whole lives. So it's perfectly fine and valid every time you feel any kind of way about anyone. So that took a little while for me. And then you know, as I'm sure you both know, there's this constant coming out that you have to do every
Yeah.
time you have a new group of people, and you're not always sure when the best time is. You don't want to have to always be wearing a t-shirt or waving a flag, because it is a part of your identity, but it's not all of who you are. So I think, yeah, just having other friends in the LGBTQ community helped me with that. And then, you know, being married to a man who's also bisexual, that was helpful, but we have a lot of assumed heteronormative privilege because of that. So we often have to tell people, yes, we're allies, but also. So yeah, it's just a sort of constant coming out and renegotiating what that means for us, and then what it means to everybody who we are in contact with.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for being able to share that. And how about you, Evelyn?
Nigel, I really identify with your story because it's not all that dissimilar to mine. I'm also, I guess, a bit of a latecomer to the realization and the true exploration of my own sexuality. I was also in about the same age. I can't remember if it was early 30s or so, that I literally, met someone who I found extremely attractive, who was not available at the time, but it was someone who I was doing work with, and I experienced all of the feelings, the attraction, the excitement of seeing someone, working with them, things like that, and that really sort of started the ball for me. I had always worked as an ally. In fact, I still have my button that says I'm straight but not narrow. It doesn't apply, hasn't applied for many years, but it's part of my history. One part that I thought was really important to me at the time when I was sort of dealing with this issue for myself, I had the wonderful mentorship of someone, her name was Leslie, who I was doing work with at the state capitol. And this is before I was in office. But I confided in her how I had my own confusing feelings and concerns and wondering and things like that. Thankfully, I was already very open-minded all the way around. But there was a very significant moment in which I shared with this particular mentor of mine where I was. And she simply looked at me with a big smile and said, Evelyn, bisexual is okay too. And, that sort of really opened the door for me to develop my own self-identity. I absolutely self-identify as bisexual. I am in a loving and committed relationship with a woman. That is how I came out publicly. And in fact, I use those words. And we have now been married for over 22 years, legally so more like 10 years. But that's how it worked for me. I had the full support of the closest person in my life, who was my mother. And that was my first coming out with someone that I loved, and it, no surprise to me, worked out really well. But I very much identify with the many years later still having to, especially when you self-identify as bisexual, having to sort of redefine that and educate people and, let them know time and time again. So the constant coming out is something I very much identify with.
Yeah, I still identify with the constantly coming out myself. Even as someone who is quote unquote professionally queer working at the New Haven Pride
Right.
Center, I still have people get confused, which is hilarious. At the same time, I think I came to terms with it a little bit younger, and I think just speaks to, the change in our society. I was about 11 or 12, and I just had this big crush on a just very beautiful girl. However, I was, her family was really homophobic, and as loving and, accepting as my parents are, I think they just didn't want me to, have crushes on anyone, but I think they were kind of scared for me. So the moment that I kind of liked this boy, I just decided I was straight for a very long time, until about later in high school and moving off to college, where I felt much more comfortable openly identifying as queer and as bisexual, and eventually someone who uses they, them, theirs pronouns. So it was an ongoing journey of really, fluidity and accepting myself, going from like bi to straight to lesbian to bi again to non-binary woman and all sorts of things. So it's definitely a complicated process, and I think it just requires finding those people, as you said, the mentors that you talk to your mother, to the people in your life to really lift you up and to tell you that it's okay to be who you are. So thank you for sharing those stories and for speaking to those experiences. Evelyn, you in particular came out while in office as a state representative. Can you describe that story in your own words, and what's different now from how you felt at the time? I'm sure it was very anxiety inducing. So what do you think has changed for you?
So here's how that story goes, actually. I had been elected to the Connecticut House of Representatives. Before that, I had run for office twice and lost. But once I was elected in a special election in 1997, I was representing a district that it was the 4th Assembly District in Hartford. And the great majority of the families that I represented were Latino families, many families living in poverty, lots of Puerto Rican families, and really a diverse population that I had gained their trust enough to be elected to represent them. So when I first ran, I was not out. And that was in 1997. However, it became pretty quickly apparent that that's not the choice I needed to have made. And so in the summer of 97, after, obviously consulting with my now wife and my family members and those who advised me politically as well, I decided that I did need to come out publicly, so I did it pretty quickly. In the summer of 97 at the Gay Pride Parade, I delivered a speech. And in that speech, I came out publicly as an openly bisexual woman in a loving, committed relationship with a woman. Those were literally the words that I used. And so with about 7,000 people in the crowd, I had a wonderful reception because obviously it was Gay Pride. But I decided to make it even more interesting, and in that I had not told my then partner that I was going to do this. And towards the end of my speech, I asked the crowd to indulge me and let me speak to her directly. And I asked her to stand up. She was in the crowd, and I proceeded to propose to her.
Oh,
So thank you. So I did that publicly as well.
oh.
And I knew it would get the attention of some of the press, but I did not know it was going to get that much attention. And sure enough, that was the part that everybody focused on a great deal. But it was an interesting, very interesting time. I'll tell you what, to close this part of my remarks, what it was really like. Obviously, there was a lot of celebration right there at the Gay Pride celebration. We need to go home that night. We lived in one of the neighborhoods in the city, and once we were home alone, we both experienced a level of fear that we perhaps had not thought of, and that was, what is tomorrow morning going to be like? What reception are we going to get? Are people going to look at us, look at me particularly as an elected official differently? And so the next morning, we got up and we needed to go run some errands, and we, with a lot of trepidation, went downstairs. We lived in an apartment, a second floor apartment, and we went downstairs to go to our car. And I'll never forget this. At a little bit of a distance, I heard a man's voice calling my name, and I slowly turned around thinking, here it comes, something bad is about to happen. And what it turned out to be was my neighbor across the street, who I knew fairly well, who was a Hartford police officer, waving at me and saying, "Congratulations, I'm proud of you." So
Beautiful.
that really, a lot of the press came, hit after that. But that was the first signal that things would be okay. And I've always, for all the 20 some odd years since then, I've really appreciated that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Nija, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but we've talked about this before as well. How do you make your queer identity visible in your organizing work? Especially as, bi erasure is such a huge issue and something that I think both Evelyn and I can relate to. How do you make that present in your work, or when do you think it's okay for it to take a backseat?
I think sometimes it depends on the group that you're with at the moment. What is it that that group is focusing on? Like when I'm with the Women's March, we're focusing on a bunch of different issues, so it can always be brought up. But if, you're with a group that's focusing on one particular social justice issue, then it does feel kind of awkward. You're like, well, how do I say, well, as a bisexual Black woman, and I found that sometimes that's exactly what I have to say, just like that, because obviously people see that I'm Black and they make assumptions about, what kind of experiences I have, and some are right and some are wrong. So it's always good to clarify those. So then, you just try to throw in as many adjectives about yourself as you can. And then if somebody wants to continue talking about one aspect or multiple aspects of that, then they can. But, you sort of just lead with what you want to present and then talk about why you feel the way you do about a certain issue, and hopefully they understand, or you can explain further why in particular you are unique in your perspective and why you want them to listen to it, because you realize that other people out there who have the same perspective might not be heard. And so it's important that you're being heard by this group who's going to be, pushing the agenda. It's great to have allies in anything, but at a certain point, allies need to sort of be a little quiet and take a little step back and let the people who it's actually affecting be the ones to deal with it. And so that's always, a negotiation you hopefully are always entering into with people with good intentions. But yeah, you have to sort of lead with confidence, even if you're not feeling confident at the time, which can be hard. But that being direct, I find, is usually, the best way. And it does get easier to be more confident about who you are and what you think the more you do it. And when you're in a safer space, then you feel like you can do it sooner. And then it just becomes well practiced. Like when you and I were talking about this before, I was saying that I don't feel, that it's difficult to talk about anymore, but I did. But after so long, it just becomes so innate, and you realize that your experience and your thoughts are valid, so you want them to be heard.
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you both for sharing your stories here and for those really inspiring words and really meaningful message. As someone who's 22 and graduating college and entering the world, I can say that things, because of people like you, things are quite a bit easier for me. At the same time, it's not really a walk in the park. I think I can speak for us all, at least, in saying that I sobbed when Representative Katie Hill put out that really touching but heartbreaking letter about why she had to step down from office. As a bisexual woman and as a survivor of intimate partner violence myself, that just ripped my heart to pieces when I read that. So it's definitely difficult. What keeps you going when you see things like that? What advice would you give to young women like myself, young queer women, especially young queer women of color who are seeing the news and know that things are easier on one hand and still really difficult on the other?
I think what you just said about how people like Evelyn and I have made it easier for you, that's what I do. I look to people like Evelyn and other women, especially women of color who've gone through this before. It's so inspiring. So, you take a minute and feel bad because it's something to feel bad about. And then, I don't know, I can draw strength easily from others. So I look to the people, who I know will support me, and the people who will be, sort of more tender with you for a little while and understanding of why you might be feeling extra vulnerable. And then I look to the people who've already done it. And, if they could keep going, then so could I. It's hard enough being a woman always, and it's hard enough anytime you add on any extra pressures like being in politics or any extra marginalized groups, like whether it's a disability or it's not being straight or not being white. It's always just that much harder. And so you look to the people who have been succeeding at intersectional social justice and just try to follow the path that they've already set.
Absolutely.
Those are such great points, Nija. I think that to this day, I still also, know who the people are that I can look to for direct support, for, for the emotional and personal support that I may need along the way. I was, interestingly enough, I was the first openly bisexual state legislator in the country, which I didn't realize at the time. And that, thank you. It may have felt a little bit lonely at the time, but I've always been able to look at all levels, to the young people who inspire me so much, and to those that came before me as well. And then the other piece that I find that keeps me going, and I wouldn't be surprised if this applies to Niger as well, that is that I feel a very strong responsibility to bring all of me, all of my identities, and all of my intersectionality to every table that I'm in. And I recognize this in a lot of just before, that we do carry sort of, it's not a burden, it is a privilege, in fact, but also a responsibility to make sure that we represent everyone who may not be at that table, but who we can be there for them. So that I find that it's a real push for me.
Yeah, I was thinking about that work of finding intersecting identities as well. I apologize, a little bit of a lisp. But as a queer and Jewish person myself, I've been thinking a lot about how both of those identities carry with a strong legacy of fighting for liberation and for social justice. And that both of those identities and my identity as a woman really motivate me and inform my beliefs and what I think is essential to the work that needs to get done. So having this sort of cultural identity and all of these different groups of people that I know support me because of those is really essential. Even as homophobia and transphobia and anti-Semitism and racism and sexism are extraordinarily prevalent, I think that seeking people who identify the same way as you do is really, really powerful. Yeah. So some of the tougher questions. How familiar are you two with the term identity politics?
Very.
Very.
I feel like it's pushed upon you, so you sort of have to learn it, very quickly.
And I think, Evelyn, it's the same.
Very much.
Yeah. I know it's become a bit of a dirty word, implying that a politician or an organizer or group is centering their identity, such as us saying that we're LGBTQ identified queer women, rather than the issues. But I think I can speak for us and say that identity is important. It's part of why we're all here today. So what's your take on this? How do you manage to bring your identity to your work without it overshadowing it?
Well, I think that, in my case, because we're talking about being in office, and I'll go back to perhaps another story that I experienced while I was in office, and it may be illustrative of what we're trying to get down to. So after I came out publicly during the next year, which was my first re-election year, I ended up having an opponent who was a Pentecostal minister who ran a hugely homophobic campaign. I mean, extremely homophobic, to the point where, his literature talked about how I wanted to recruit our children, all of those really ridiculous things to say. And in fact, his slogan, which was plastered all over the district on signs, was in Spanish, and it said "No metas la pata," which "No metas la pata" is a saying that we use when you make a mistake, like don't make a mistake, don't put your foot in the wrong place. However, the word pata is also the most derogative term for lesbian as well. And he used that in the campaign. That was the messaging that he used. So obviously my identity was all over that particular race. However, if you remember, I told you that the district that I represented was, a district replete with a lot of people living in poverty, a lot of people of color, particularly a lot of Puerto Rican families. And many people thought after I came out publicly that I would not be able to regain their vote. So what we did was never shied away from the identity that I had put out to the world that now this opponent was using against me. But we ran a real grassroots campaign where I knocked on every possible door that I could knock on. And I listened to people and I told them what issues I was working on. I can't tell you how many times I went to a door where if the person had not met me before, if my opponent had also been to their door, they would come on and say, "Oh, did you know that we have this representative and she's gay and how horrible," and things like that. And I got to stand there and say, you're talking about me, and that is, I self-identify as bisexual, and I came out publicly on purpose. And by the way, here is my literature, and let me tell you about the issues that I'm determined to work on for you. And that ended up resonating, and it resonated so well, actually, that my opponent's campaign was so homophobic and so insulting that I think people turned against him, even if they may have not been totally happy with me, because one part of my identity was being hurt in their eyes, and that's as a Puerto Rican woman. So you see, you bring all of these identities into the equation, and we did. We ended up winning that race, not just by a small margin, but by a huge margin, with 88% of the vote. So I've always called upon that story for myself to remind myself that people who are so often expected to not be able to make up their own minds, to not be informed about what really matters, meaning that community, they were the ones who decided that they still wanted me to do the job, and so they voted for me. So that's my story of how bringing all of my identities into the political realm have worked.
That's incredibly brave. Wow. Sorry, I'm just very overwhelmed by the emotion that story evokes. Really being able to go face to face with someone who is repeating the homophobic nonsense that's been told to them is an incredibly brave thing to do, but really important and powerful work. And, as someone who wants to get into political organizing and knows that I'm facing that, I really can say just thank you for doing that work, not only just for yourself and for your campaign, but for people like me. I really, really appreciate that. Yeah, and then I also wanted to move talk about this with Nija as well, especially as you're one of the amazing organizers of the Women's March Connecticut, which is unfortunately something that I think people have criticized strongly for focusing on identity politics, just because of its simple name. What do you think is important about, women's issues in particular, and how do you think we can have a substantive movement that really encompasses the issues while also centering people's identities?
Oh, I think what Evelyn was saying was exactly right. You have to bring all of your identities with you at all times. And when you can find what you have in common with someone, then what your messages will resonate with them, regardless of what else is different about you. And that's the thing about politics, is when you get a chance to talk with people individually, especially, you can explain to them fairly quickly how, regardless of you not being the same race, or maybe the same gender sometimes, or the same, sexual preference, that you're still affected by this economic issue, or by, this medical issue or something like that. And so in the Women's March, like many of the organizations that cropped up after the 2016 election, it's very seemingly centered on white middle class to upper class women. And a lot of times that's because they do have the privilege of having more time and money and energy to spend on that. And you always need people like that. So, I don't like when they're discounted, or when people who don't look like them are tokenized. That's happened to me, in particular with the Women's March, which it's really offensive that somebody would think I don't know myself or what I'm doing, or I'm just here to, be a puppet or face. But it is up to us, like Evelyn said, it's our responsibility, not a burden, to always bring back to focus. By the way, we also need to focus on how this issue affects these kind of women, because it is different. And women's issues, we have so much more power when we're all together, and we see that repeatedly. But you do have to remind people that the experience that one woman has might not be the same for another, and why that is, and how we can fix that, so that we're always having, an equitable experience. And part of that is really just lots of talking. The women in particular, like with the other groups I'm involved with, we try to have a lot of conversation amongst ourselves before we go out and talk with other people, just to make sure that we aren't going to go out there and say something without thinking about how it's received. I mean, you can't always control that, but you can sort of try to prepare for it. And it's hard. It's, identity politics, like you said, has become a really dirty phrase. But I like Evelyn's spin on it. It's like you bring all of your identities at all times when you show up, because you are affected in different ways. And everybody needs to be aware of the different ways that everyone else is affected when you're fighting for the same cause. Because, getting minimum wage raised is great, but that still is going to affect other people differently, just like getting hired or getting a promotion. It's great if we could get equal pay for women, but is it going to be equal pay amongst all women? I mean, we know that how much less women get compared to men varies on, the race and sexual preference and things like that. So it's a lot of ongoing work, but it's rewarding, and you keep at it, because when you see the difference it makes you want to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the thing people don't understand about bringing identities to the table sometimes is that it's not just about oh, vote for me, or oh, trust me because I identify as X. It's about bringing it to the policies and your ways of viewing the issues. Back when I was organizing on campus as a student around both, reforming Title IX, how our school responds to sexual violence, and then later organizing against Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination. One of the things that I thought was really important for me to bring to the table is that my experience was not the same, some random white frat boy, assaulted me. My experience happened in a very queer context, in a queer space, and that a lot of LGBTQ folks experience the same things. We experience actually high rates of intimate partner violence as, bisexual women than many others, regardless of the gender identity of the partner. Lesbian women and straight women experience it at the same rates, and we simply don't have enough data on transgender women. And sometimes, making sure that I am openly speaking to my individual experience and how that makes me view the issue, and seeing it in a more intersectional lens of, an issue of power, an issue of, structural inequality and community response, as opposed to, sometimes I think the oversimplified narrative of, the young woman that walks into a frat party, which is still a really important narrative to discuss, and something that still rings true with a lot of people, but isn't inclusive of everyone's experience. I did want to, bounce back to Evelyn a little bit and talk about, were there any policy issues that you were working on while you were in office where you felt that your identities, in any sense of the word, were really important to your advocacy around that as a state representative?
Sure. I mean, all of my identities played into a lot of the work that I got to do as a legislator. I actually came into office with a really, really strong um, uh, desire to work on behalf of people who still don't have access to quality health care. And so I served in the Public Health Committee at my request, and did a lot of work there that was tied to access to healthcare. A lot of issues there. I also, because I, felt that I represented the Puerto Rican community, I represented in a different way, communities of color as well. Our ability to participate in the democratic process has always been extremely important to me. And I felt very strongly about campaign finance reform because I felt there was one way, not the only one, but certainly one way to level the playing field, so that we could have better representation and more diversity in elected officials. Now, did I work on gay marriage? Of course I did. Did I work on, in fact, I put in a lot of work on, before the marriage issue was in Connecticut, we had the second parent adoption issue that I worked on very strongly. And so, those tended to be the focus of my efforts.
Absolutely. All right. So I wanted to start closing off the conversation a little bit and ask you if you had any advice to young women in general, to LGBTQ identified women who are interested in running for office. And Evelyn, you have 2 daughters. Naja, you're expecting a baby. What would you want to say to them? What would you want them to get out of this conversation? If you could speak to them.
Well, let me see. You're right. I have 2 daughters, and learning that you can love a child the way that a parent loves a child was still a terrific and eye-opening moment for me from the time that I first became a mother. And I have always tried to be an example to them, not just in the typical way where you tell your child you can be anything that you want to be, but that you can also, make the trouble that's necessary to sometimes make to change things. And because I love to tell stories, let me tell you this other one. When my now 19-year-old daughter, when she was 6 years old, I believe it was the year that, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. I believe it was the year that Rosa Parks passed away. And I was reading an article about Rosa in the newspaper, and my 6-year-old daughter walked up to me and asked me, "What are you reading?" So I told her about Rosa Parks. And I told her the story. This is why I'm reading it. She recently passed away, and this is what she did. And my 6-year-old daughter looked at me and said, "Oh, so you mean she stood up for justice?"
Oh,
Yes. To this day, that's been like my proudest moment, for my child. They've seen me do a lot of other things as well, but the simplicity of a moment like that really matters to me. And if I wanted to give advice to other young women in particular, it's that, politics is not that scary. Sometimes we think it is. We think it is the realm only of certain people. But the truth is that politics benefits from many points of views, many identities, and many experiences. So I encourage young people, especially women, to look at getting involved in politics. And by the way, it can be fun too. It can be empowering and it can be fun, and at the same time, some parts of it is infuriating. But we have a responsibility to represent ourselves, our families, and those who may not be at the table. So I always encourage, anytime I meet a new candidate who's considering running for office and as a woman, I get very excited and I'm ready to, you know, uh, help them work on their campaign, anything like that.
Absolutely. Right. And Nigel.
I love that, Evelyn. I love that about the simple moments. That's a
Yeah.
really great way to illustrate what it is to be a parent. It's not just look at me when I'm at work or look at me, on my soapbox for various reasons, but in your everyday moments. And I think that's exactly what, I hope I'll strive to do just by living, that'll be your example. And I agree with you about politics. Before the political world, which it's kind of weird to think about my life before then because it consumes most of my life now in the best way. I love all things performing arts, especially theater world. And I've met some of the best people, made some of the best connections, people that I know will be friends for life with this kind of work. So as hard as it definitely is sometimes and frustrating and sad and, makes you more tired than you ever thought possible, it's so rewarding to see something move, especially if a bill passes or something like that, just to see the progress within your lifetime, which if you think about it, that used to be nearly impossible. It took multiple generations before real change happened on any social justice issue. So the fact that we can get that done sooner is really inspiring. So remembering how hard it was for people before, like you talked about Rosa Parks, I don't know if I would have had, the gumption to do that. I always think, not that my life isn't hard in some ways, but I'm comfortable most of the time. So the idea of something knowing that is extra hard for you, it's like, I don't think I could do that by myself, without a strong group of people at the same time. But that's what kept happening over and over until enough people got together and there was power in all of those movements. So it's always the ring to keep going. And also, like Evelyn said, sometimes you have to cause trouble. I love Rep. John Lewis. He says, get into good trouble. And that's what I aim to do. I get into good trouble. And if somebody doesn't like it, then they're not somebody that, I need to spend time around. There's that saying, those who mind don't matter and those who matter don't mind. And that's sort of, it's hard sometimes. We often want to sort of kowtow to what society or somebody else tells us to do, parents or a boss or something like that, when they're just worried about you. They're looking out for your best interest, but you have to be true to yourself. One life to live. So, make a difference. And the people who you need to support you will come out when they believe the same things. And I love when women come into politics, whether it's running for office, being a campaign manager, being a treasurer, and right now is the time. People are actually embracing it. If you're a woman, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman of color, people want you. And, don't let anyone tokenize you, but, go for it. Put yourself out there. This is the best time you could ever do that. So it's exciting, like Evelyn said, to see all the women who've been coming up in the last few years. It feels like we finally arrived. It feels really good.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're opening it up to our audience real quick. I put a message in the chat because that's the best way I could figure out how to do this. I apologize, we're still experimenting in Zoom. So thanks, Fabs, for your very sweet note. And if anyone wants to type a question in the chat or say, hi, I'd like to go live, just put it in over the next couple of minutes. But first off, we have a question from Catherine. Asking, how is social distancing impacting your work and what are you doing to stay motivated and continue the agenda? So especially relevant to ask, someone, Evelyn, you do campaign consulting. We've all, done field work. I am very much considering this question right now as an organizer at the Pride Center. How are we going to be able to make sure we can continue our advocacy work despite the fact that we can't go face-to-face with people?
That's such a great question. You're right, I do continue, even though I've been out of office now for about 12 years, but I've continued to run campaigns and advise candidates and other campaigns as well. And, this environment that we're facing, that we're finding ourselves in, is really making us think differently. I just, I'm going to start working with a candidate soon as part of my business, that is running for the first time, is challenging an incumbent, just like I did, and I'm very excited about her candidacy. And but at the same time, I know that I have to think very differently. I, like you, probably, I'm a real field person. There is campaign strategy, there is online strategies, and then there's advertising and mail and things like that. And those things all matter and can come together in an effective campaign. But my heart is always in the field. And that is where you go door to door, basically, and you talk directly to individuals. So with the situation, we cannot do that. So I'm having to spend a lot of my own mental energy and coming up with ways in which we're going to replace that, at least for the short time. I'm not really sure what the answers are just yet, but there are some really terrific organizations out there that do online organizing that I'm looking to learn, how to do that, how to do it from that perspective.
Absolutely.
I don't have an answer yet, but I'm certainly spending a lot of my work time trying to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've also considering a job on a campaign currently, where I was supposed to be in charge of field work, and now everything's kind of up in the air. So we've been discussing that, but I think that there's a lot of creative ways of replicating this and for making things happen. In spite of this pandemic, we just got to get smart. How about you, Nigel? We've actually, this is probably an appropriate time to plug, have been in talks about organizing virtual days of action between the New Haven Pride Center and the Women's March Connecticut, as well as a variety of other awesome organizations where we're working on making sure that we're recognizing people who aren't entirely safe at home, whether it's because it's a homophobic environment, if there's a situation of intimate partner violence, or if they simply don't have the economic resources to keep themselves afloat while not working. We're also talking about the economic impact, especially on small businesses, those run by women and LGBTQ folks. We are also working on houselessness and how that particularly impacts LGBTQ youth and women. So stay tuned for more information on that. I'm really excited to think through, virtual advocacy and how we can still connect with one another and sustain a movement and build momentum, despite the fact that we're all being as responsible as we can right now for the sake of public health and staying indoors and social distancing. But yeah, I wanted to give Nigel the last word on this.
I think that hopefully in all campaigns in recent years, there has been an online aspect. So sort of now is the time for anyone who's been doing that to really shine and teach others. Good old-fashioned phone calls are great. So you can get a good list together. I say make a phone call. A lot of people, who aren't familiar with technology are not going to be as comfortable, doing Zoom like we are. I think in a few months we'll all be experts, and that's great. Yeah. Because seeing somebody really helps you connect with them. But, good old-fashioned phone calls really, I think, make a difference. It's something that campaigns use all the time anyway. So I think that, we're still not sure about if postcards are going to be a good thing or not, but phone calls, doing phone calls, maybe spending more time on those phone calls than we normally would do. People who've done phone banks know that you're supposed to only spend like 2 to 3 minutes, and I don't think that's going to apply now.
Yeah.
But doing phone calls, I would have said I'm not so much a field person like the two of you. I sort of like to have an event and then at the event mingle and talk to people like that. That's where I was fine, which again, we can't do that right now either. So yeah, phone calls, emails, if we do postcards, that sort of a thing, but really trying to reach out to organizations and groups that already have, an email list or some other way of tracking people who follow them or are interested in them, and reaching out to that group first. and then asking them to ask a friend. I feel like the ask a friend, ask one person is something that works really well. It doesn't feel too overwhelming, and that way people can still, you know, be involved. And it's been really heartening to see how many community members do want to do something and are involved. We see how many people are, you know, like you said before, Miranda, doing food runs. And when I was talking about people providing PPEs for our healthcare workers. So I think we'll be able to still do that, because we don't want to take away from that, but have people focus on, so these are things that are still going on and still important that we would be focusing on if we weren't dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's time to get back to those things. And yeah, I expect good results.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think that despite the fact that times seem really bleak right now, there's a lot of opportunity for growth and for connecting with people despite having to maintain a certain level of physical distance. And I'm really excited to see how things go. Here at the New Haven Pride Center, we're doing our best to adapt. As a community center that also, as Nigel was talking about, thrives on events. And I think there's a lot of ways to socially connect in spite of the times that we're in. So I'm really excited to see what the future holds and really feeling kind of hopeful, because I think that at the end of the day, this is actually bringing out the best in people, and that we're going to you know, do some great things. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to quickly plug our next speaker event over Zoom. It'll be a conversation similar to this one, hosted by our amazing youth program officer on, okay, I'm just gonna mute and remove that person. Oh, thank you, whoever's on the iPhone right now. Sorry, the name isn't popping up, but I really appreciate the thanks for our guests and for the Pride Center. And yeah, so All is going to be hosting a conversation on you know, Black feminism with a couple of really amazing guests. Yes, thank you, Dolores. So this is really awesome. And with that, if you came in late or didn't catch this, the whole event was recorded, so you can go back and watch the first half or whatever parts that you missed. And I just want to send such a gratitude to both of you, not only for being here today, but for the work that you do and for being such sources of inspiration. Thank you. Any final words?
Just a simple thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for inviting us. I think that that's the kind of thing we need to do to keep, you know, getting better, is to continue to stay in communication with each other, physical or not, to always keep connecting, to be able to help each other wherever we need it and support each other wherever we need it. So events like this are great. So thank you, Miranda. Thank you, New Haven Pride Center.
Absolutely.
Same here. Thank you, New Haven Pride Center, and you, Miranda. I think these conversations are great to continue to have. So I really appreciate you organizing them and sticking it out. We were going to do this in person, and I think this was a great conversation virtually as well.
All right, awesome. It was really great to see your lovely faces, and thank you for everyone that was here to listen in. All right, have a wonderful day. I'm going to end this meeting and sign off.
Thanks.
All right.